Hello, I'm Penny Thornton and I'm talking astrology. On this video, I'm talking about the Jupiter-Saturn cycle, or more specifically, the forthcoming Jupiter-Saturn square. Now, this is the second of three videos I'm doing about this middle period of August. It's so important, so many alignments that are worthy of mention. We're in a very, very fast-moving period. Things are changing day by day, new things coming into the arena. So even with my first video on this all-important 19th of August and the run-up to it in terms of what's going on, when I spoke about Kamala Harris, we were only just at the beginning, literally the day that she was, pushed into prominence because of Joe Biden's stepping back. And so it was by no means assured that she was going to get the party behind her. But of course, by the time we got to, well, yesterday, actually, then the time had gone for other people to come forward and with their bid for the nomination for the presidency. So she's clean and clear at this time. Obama has given his backing. So a lot of things that had a question mark over them in my first video are now answered. But of course, there are many more question marks to come, and I hope to address those as we go through this. The third video, which I'll be doing, looks again at these quite important alignments and looks at it really from the perspective of all 12 signs, so that those of you who love the kind of general astrology get to put yourself in the driver's seat, so to speak, and kind of look at it from a sort of personal sun sign angle. Anyway, why is this so important? Why is this Jupiter-Saturn square worthy of comment? Well, the Jupiter-Saturn cycle is one of the most important cycles that astrologers look at and that has an effect on all of us. And we have a lot of cycles that we look at, some of which I have already looked at, the Saturn-Pluto cycle, the Saturn-Uranus cycle, the Jupiter-Uranus cycle. We even had, or I even did a big video earlier on this year about the all-important Jupiter-Uranus conjunction. So here we come with this Jupiter-Saturn square, which is worthy of probably two videos all on its own, but I'm going to try to collapse it all into just this one. So like all cycles, they begin on a conjunction, and by the time the two have met at certain stations along that zodiac circle, they come back to the beginning again, usually in different signs and obviously with a lot of different background activity, by which I mean lots of planets in different places and other sort of configurations. For instance, I've already mentioned we had the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction this year, and now we have the Jupiter-Saturn. So everything that I'm going to be talking about must also be framed in or seen in the context of other planetary alignments that are also extremely important. So a Jupiter-Saturn cycle, when Jupiter and Saturn come into conjunction, this is known as a great conjunction. And it's super important right from early times, perhaps the times when we were, well, pre-Christ really, BC, when astronomers and astrologers, they were astrologers, they thought each aspect of what was going on in the celestial sphere was important, not just to measure what was going on, but also to find meaning in it. And since Jupiter was the biggest planet in the solar system, very visible, easy to see, and Saturn also visible, but Saturn was at that point in time the very end of all the planets. There was nothing beyond Saturn. That's where the limits were. So these two mighty planets, mighty for different reasons, having any kind of relationship with each other was considered to be extremely important for affairs of state. the great big things of life happening on Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions particularly, but also along their cycle, Jupiter-Saturn squares, Jupiter-Saturn oppositions, well, one opposition, two squares. And it was the birth of kings, the death of kings, the arrival of big, new and important developments for a nation, new regimes, new governments, old governments falling. So, and I just mentioned the idea of affairs of state. So this is why these two planets were so incredibly important. So not only do these planets, Jupiter and Saturn, when they come into conjunction, they have a 20-year cycle to go through. And if you divide that roughly, it's every 4+ years or so that it has a station. And by a station, I mean it squares, Jupiter squares Saturn, Jupiter opposes Saturn, Jupiter squares Saturn again. And it takes 20 years or so, just a little bit under, for that to be complete. Now, when a new conjunction starts, it's always in a different sign. Obviously, 20 years go by, and Jupiter itself takes 12 years to go around the zodiac. So you can see it's going to be in a different sign every time. But that's not the really important thing. What we have is an even bigger cycle than a 20-year cycle happening, and that's a 240-year cycle, because in the time, or in the span of time of about 240 years, then Jupiter and Saturn are always coming together, starting their cycle in the same element. And of course, the elements are fire, earth, air, and water. So this can be, for instance, if it's in an earth sign, that means the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction can occur in Capricorn, in Taurus, and in Virgo. And now, having shifted into air signs, is going to occur in Aquarius, Gemini, or Libra. So we have a variety, or do you call 3 a variety? But in that process of 240 years, when it's always occurring in a particular element, it differs between which actual sign of that element group it appears in. Now, again, it's not an exact science, and those of you who are really keen astrologers are going to pick me up on this straight away and say, all right, so we were in a 240-year cycle where there were earth signs. However, in 1980, 1981, all Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions that happened at that time occurred in the sign of Libra, which is an air sign, and you will get those sorts of anomalies. But I think the important thing, too, to consider about this Jupiter-Saturn cycle is that not only do we have a great conjunction when Jupiter and Saturn are conjoined at the beginning of their cycle, but we have something else called the greatest conjunction, and that happens every 960 years, so almost a millennium. And when that happens, it means that the whole cycle has gone back to its original point. And you can imagine if already a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction is very meaningful in terms of affairs of state and the death and birth of kings and leaders and regimes and all sorts of other very important global events. There can be a sort of major disasters sometimes, but also major things happening that really affect humanity, societally and politically, all these things. You can imagine if that is happening on the greatest conjunction, then things are kind of supra important. And in fact, if we think about this, and we think about another really, really great and important conjunction in Pisces in 7 BC, that was called a triple conjunction. It happened 3 times in the space of 12 months. And of course, we have since associated that with the birth of Jesus Christ. And again, to come back and think about those early astronomer priests, astronomy in those days, the observation of the celestial sphere, not only empirically, but also mathematically, figuring out when planets and stars appeared in a certain place. To the astronomers, of those early pre-Christian days and on really through into medieval times, it wasn't just the empirical science and where everything was in its place and how long it took to get there. It was also interpretation that these events meant something for life on Earth. And of course, we can imagine the astronomer priests who were effectively the Magi, making their journey following the star in the east, which was almost certainly that big triple conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in Pisces. And this is also very interesting if we look at that a little bit more closely, because, of course, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction was in Pisces. And if you remember the early Christians, their symbol was the fish. And, whether or not they decided that should be their symbol based on, guidance that this was the fishes and therefore it was a symbol of a great king, a great savior who was coming, or whether it just happened that that became the symbol, so to speak. It's significant. And what is also significant is that that whole area of Palestine, Israel, it was Jupiter considered to rule the sign of Pisces, and that sign ruling Palestine. And Saturn in Pisces is always considered to have something to do, or did have something to do, with the Israelites. So I find that quite interesting when we go back 2,000 years and think about the king of the Jews and the savior that came in on that Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Pisces. And we look at what's going on at this particular time, especially with the war in Gaza. Again, we've got Saturn in Pisces. Jupiter has moved into a different place, but it's a kind of resonance, which, as all astrologers, I find very interesting. Another point that I'd like to make about the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction is that there are two ways of, I might say calculating it, but recognizing it. Let's put it that way. There is a way mathematically where you take the average of when these two planets, should come together, so to speak, in their big cycles. And there's also observations, so that we actually see Jupiter-Saturn in conjunction. And when we look at the ephemeris, we see they're in conjunction on a particular day at a particular time. And I have to say that I think almost all astrologers will be using the latter, so that it's observational. We know exactly where Jupiter and Saturn are in their cycles through the zodiac, and they meet at a certain point on the same degree, and that is the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. Now, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction that kicked off this cycle began on the 21st of December, 2020. Now, I remember it well. It was a very important conjunction, not only because we began a whole new set, a whole 240-year cycle in a way beginning, because all the Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions are going to be in air signs, with the anomaly I've already mentioned, but broadly speaking. But also that Jupiter-Saturn conjunction was the closest it had been for 400, almost 500 years. So there was a really big set of expectations about what this actually meant. And of course, being in Aquarius and Pluto heading into Aquarius as well, it was almost as though this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction was the herald of the new age of Aquarius. So there were a variety of reasons why this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction on December the 21st, 2020 was such a talking point, generally with everybody looking at it. Astronomy, astronomers very fascinated by it, and of course astrologers very, very keen on what it all meant. Now, I happened to be in Sweden at the time, and I remember thinking, I've got to take a photograph of this, and running out with my camera, my phone camera, on the night, having seen this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction forming in the sky. But it was very, very difficult to photograph, and Jupiter and Saturn, with the naked eye, could not really be seen as separate entities. What happened instead was a sort of globe of light. Now, when I took it and showed everyone else, they all said, oh, well, isn't that just the full moon? And I said, no, it wasn't a full moon. That was how it looked at the time, this kind of fuzzy glow, large in the sky. So I want to show you what it was that I saw personally. I witnessed that Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. This is what I was looking at. But thankfully, there were people with proper cameras and super telescopes, and this is what it would have looked like had I got better equipment. And as you can see, it's a rather beautiful thing. But this idea that they are together, and depending on where you were in the world and how you look at this, then sometimes the two would be so close together that it looked like one great star. So I'm going back to the idea of the star in the east again. So I'll be talking a little bit more about the effects of a Jupiter-Saturn square, particularly as we go forward. But let's understand, first of all, of the principles that we're using. We're now 2,000 years on from that brilliant star in the east, and here we are looking, certainly as astrologers, at two very different principles. We're looking at Jupiter, the principle of expansion, and we're looking at Saturn, the principle of contraction. So these two planets have very different functions, very different properties, but together they really form a mighty pair. This is why they preside over affairs of state and important things that happen to us in our particular life. But basically, yes, we're looking at the idea of things being expanded, things growing, things being, very upfront and powerful, and at the same time, things also being quite difficult, quite challenging, and in some cases being restrictive. So we've got a kind of existential tension working when we put these two planets together. But they can have a very good effect on business. They can be very useful. It's very quite auspicious to begin a very big business venture on a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. And coming back into my memory bank, it always seemed as though there had been an astrological hand in the setting of the wedding between Charles and Diana on this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in 1981, on the exact day, and that was in the sign of Libra. So those are the kind of events that you want to be thinking of when you think about how these planets operate and also why they are of significance. Now, a very fascinating aspect to this Jupiter-Saturn cycle is relative to America and the election of presidents. Now, every president that is elected on a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, the time of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, often has an ineluctable destiny, we might call it. And it's very interesting. This is often touted as the president who is elected being under Temescar's curse. Now, Temescar was a Native American chief, and back in the mid-1800s, well, there are two versions of this story, but the first version is there was some goings on to do with a land that was not appreciated by Tecumseh. And the result of that was that the governor at the time, and that was William Harrison, who then went on to become president of America a year later. He planted a curse on the presidency. And there's another version of this tale, and that is that Tecumseh and his brother in the battle, at a big battle, Tecumseh lost his life, and in response, his brother put a curse, same kind of curse, on the presidency or the future presidency of the United States. So be that as it may, and it's a little bit spooky, isn't it? But nevertheless, I should give you a list of all the presidents who did not fare too well after being elected on a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. And I need to have a look at my list here so I don't mislead you. 1840, William Harrison. He died of pneumonia in office. Abraham Lincoln, 1860. Well, I think we're all familiar with what happened to Abraham Lincoln. He was assassinated. 1900, William McKinley assassinated. 1920, Warren Harding, heart attack. 1940, FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, died of a cerebral hemorrhage. 1960, JFK assassinated. 1980, Ronald Reagan, an attempted assassination. The year 2000, George W. Bush, was a live grenade thrown at his feet, failed to explode, which was lucky. Otherwise, that would also have fitted the bill. And now we come to 2020, and Joe Biden has just stepped down. And I find it quite interesting that there was also an assassination attempt on the former president. So I think these things are very interesting. I mean, you can't set your clock by them. You can't say every time there's an election or a new administration begins, then, that president is going to come to his life is going to be short, but for one reason or the other. But it's interesting, and there's plenty of them, as you will see. They're all in 0 years as well. What I'd like to do is look at the chart of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction of December the 21st, 2020, so that we can see the pattern, whatever else was going on at the time, and relate it to this whole Jupiter-Saturn cycle, and most specifically to the Jupiter-Saturn square that is just ahead of us. So let's have a look at this chart, which is very, very interesting. Now, of course, I've set it from the perspective of Washington, because we are very interested about what's going on with the American election at the moment. And I find it very interesting. If we look at the major ingredients, you'll see there Jupiter and Saturn at that noon position, 0 degrees of Aquarius and, 29 minutes. And we'll see it's very, very close to Pluto. Pluto, 23 degrees of Capricorn. So Pluto is influencing that Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. And even if we think, well, that's a bit of a wide kind of aspect, and how can Pluto be influencing the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction? Well, I'll tell you why. If you come now to the rising sign, 1 degree of Taurus, and you look a little bit above it, you'll see Mars at 23 degrees of Aries. Now, in fact, Mars was exactly square to Pluto as Jupiter and Saturn began their new cycle. And a Mars-Pluto aspect, whether it's a conjunction, a square, or an opposition, is a really turbulent, kind of violent combination. Certainly very passions are aroused with a Mars-Pluto aspect, but it's also very destructive, potentially destructive. And of course, what it is, most of all, is the idea of a power struggle. And what's interesting here, if you remember, with the election results that were considered by Mr. Trump and a lot of Republicans to be a stolen election, that it wasn't won fair and square. And if you remember, on January the 6th, there was the storming of the Capitol. And I think you can see all this reflected in that Mars-Pluto square happening at the time of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. And what we also need to remember is that the start of this cycle is what this cycle is all about. So the whole of this Jupiter-Saturn cycle, this period of 20 years, is going to be one where there is a tremendous amount of power struggles and problems and conflicts and division, and we can see all this happening in front of our very eyes. We know that this is happening, and it's happening across the board. It's happening in Europe, it's happening in Russia and Ukraine, it's happening everywhere, Israel, Gaza, and this is kind of symbolized by what we can see in this particular chart. Now, I also think what is fascinating here as well is that on the day Jupiter and Saturn were conjoined and they began this big 20-year cycle, the sun was at 0 degrees of Capricorn. It was actually the winter solstice, the Capricorn ingress. So this too had a much more important effect on state matters. So a lot of things were seeded at this particular time in 2020 that will have a cast, what we might call a very, very long shadow. I also take into consideration the idea that Uranus is rising to the ascendant at that point in time of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. And of course, Jupiter and Saturn were both squaring Uranus. So in more than one part of this or place in this horoscope, we see strife, we see upset, we see conflict. And we know that at the very time this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction was in operation, there was incredible conflict in terms of the American presidency and all the controversy that was surrounding it. So now I'd like to take a look at the current, the Jupiter-Saturn square that's about to form on August the 19th. And we can see where we have moved to, and we can examine, have a look at what connections it's making to the original chart at the beginning of the Jupiter-Saturn cycle. Now, what I also want to mention, generally speaking, is that when we look at these huge cycles, these combinations of planets, the Uranus-Saturn cycle, the Saturn-Neptune cycle, which we're going to be talking about next, the Jupiter-Pluto cycle, the Jupiter-Uranus cycle, they're all, not only combining the two very different properties of the planets concerned, but what they're setting in motion at the beginning is casting what I describe as a long shadow over the period in time that cycle is ongoing. And if we think here about the stations that the two planets will make to each other, the square, the opposition, and the final square in the cycle, these are all points of assessment. These are all points at which the developments that are happening at the time in reference to what was happening at the beginning of the cycle are really, really important. Now, if we think about this in just a general way, at the first square, we are looking at what's working, what isn't working. What do we want to go forward with, and what do we want to jettison? What isn't working, what we can't make the most of. And this isn't necessarily something that we ourselves can decide, although it's kind of interesting, isn't it, when you think that America went to the polls and voted who they wanted in on the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction of 2020. And here we are in 2024 with the American people about to go back to the polls, to the voting booth, to say who they want in power. So this is really definitely a point of assessment. It's a judgment on what the previous four and a bit years have been about. And so it's the squares that are important, and it's the oppositions that are important. And this also goes back to the whole principle of aspects generally, that the squares, the conjunctions, the oppositions, and the quincunxes, the inconjuncts, are really dynamic. We get an effect, we know it, we see it, we feel it, we experience it. Now, when you get the softer aspects, you get the harmonious trines, sextiles, quintiles, those kind of things. As I often describe it, it's background music, muzak. They're there, we have to notice them, and certainly the degrees they're at, as transits move around a chart or progressions, they're going to trigger that aspect, and they're going to make a difference. But by and large, we are really, really concerned with Jupiter square Saturn, Jupiter opposition Saturn, and Jupiter square Saturn again. These are the dynamic points. These are when, in this case, to do with Jupiter-Saturn, we can expect very important affairs of state to take place, and also things that really affect peoples as a whole, nations as a whole. And I think you can see by the time we come to 2024, what kind of important elections there have been in different countries, whether it was France, whether it's the United Kingdom, whether it was Poland, and we've also had changes in Iran. There have been very, very big regime changes, really. And I think, too, when I was mentioning the whole idea of what Jupiter and Saturn, why they were so important, and I mentioned the idea of the birth of kings, the death of kings, the rise of new regimes, that really since the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius of 2021, we have seen the death of Queen Elizabeth II. That was the end of the Elizabethan age. And we've seen the advent, the crowning of a new king, and also the beginning of the Carolean age. Now, the interesting thing is that in this first quarter of the cycle, so to speak, all these things are coming up for review. And already at the start of 2024, we were met with some very difficult situations in regard to King Charles and Princess Catherine. And the whole issue about what's going to happen to the monarchy was raised and has been a really, really important issue over the whole period up to this point of the year. So again, let's broaden this hugely important Jupiter-Saturn square. Let's broaden it and take into consideration what may also be at stake in terms of the monarchy of Great Britain. We may well see some very important announcements and changes regarding the Constitution of Great Britain, and in particular, the reign of King Charles III. And another area of concern or interest really is the Israel-Gaza situation. And certainly the Jupiter-Saturn cycle is going to be very important to this situation, and whether we see some kind of escalation, widening of the war at this point, or whether we seem finally to get a little bit nearer some kind of resolution. Seems unlikely, but it's possible. That too is really in the mix when we look at this Jupiter-Saturn square and the Jupiter-Saturn cycle. So let's have a look at this actual moment when Jupiter and Saturn square each other for the first time. They meet exactly since they started their cycle in December of 2020. And this, of course, is on the 19th of August. And I think if you've seen my other video, you'll have also had a look at this chart and seen what an incredible day the 19th of August is. We've got a full moon on the 27 of Leo Aquarius, and that happens to be the USA. 27 Aquarius is the USA moon. It's also Kamala's Saturn. So we know that this full moon is going to tie up a lot of loose ends. There's going to be all sorts of things going on in relation to those factors. But we're also looking at a time when we've got another configuration. Well, let's just point out that full moon. And this, of course, is the chart of the Jupiter-Saturn square. So we're not seeing the full moon exactly because it's moved on a little bit. And what we're seeing still, though, is how the sun is exactly squaring Uranus. The moon is squaring Uranus. So we've got a big T-square in fixed signs. And there's another T-square. We've got Venus opposition Saturn, squaring Jupiter and actually Mars as well. So we've got another important kind of constellation of influences that impact, you know, things to do with the affairs of state, say very simply. So as we look at this chart, we can see here Pluto at 0 degrees of Aquarius Aquarius and 15 minutes is exactly on the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction itself when it came in. Now that is meaningful. Admittedly, a Pluto transit does take around 2, 3, 4 years to fully manifest itself, and a lot of events and developments can happen in that time. But it's interesting that actually at the time of this Saturn-Jupiter square, Pluto is exactly on that Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. So this is eruption, just a single word, eruptions. And if we have this image of a volcano, for instance, and we see the eruption, we see the flames, and we see the lava spilling out and, flowing down the mountainside, while that may be a terrifying image, the volcanic soil that is left is very fertile. And we need to look at that analogy in light of what may be happening at this time, is that we may not understand the events of the time. We may not like them. They may be quite frightening and alarming, but actually they're purposeful. And the seeds of the future are being planted in this very, very rich soil. And we should actually keep that in our minds. Now, we should also be looking at here the where Uranus has reached, because if you remember the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction chart, Uranus was rising. Now Uranus has moved on. It's 27 degrees of Taurus by this time. And so now this is in a position where it is squaring the full moon on that same day. So in a way, the turmoil and the power struggles I talked about inherent in the Jupiter-Saturn-Pluto combination, we're now seeing explosions of a different nature when we come to see this Uranus combination. Uranus rising is prone to conflict and protest and upset. Now we see that Uranus has reached a point where it is engaging with, in this case, a full moon, and a full moon that ties itself into America's chart and also Kamala Harris's chart. So we know that this is the fulfillment of the promise that began in 2020. We're seeing how far we've come, what's going to be thrown out, what is going to be no longer viable, and what's going to come out in the future, what we can go forward with. We're going to see this very clearly. I think another thing that I would like to draw your attention to is that Saturn at Neptune at 27 of Pisces in the original Jupiter-Saturn conjunction chart, Neptune is now right on that moon. So again, we have some kind of sense that whatever confusion there was, and let's face it, when we look back at 2020 and we see the confusion over the election and the choice of election, we then look at all the violence that occurred. And since then, this year particularly, all the court cases that have come about because of it, we also see the fog that people are still in about which is the right path, which candidate to choose, what is the right course of action, where is America heading? And again, we're seeing these two charts in comparison here. We can see how the future is unfolding according to the astrology of the moment. Now, I don't want to bombard you with a lot of charts that you have to sort of get your head around. I like to be very disciplined with how many charts I put up. So I just want to tell you, I'm mentioning the monarchy and mentioning that I think that this August-September period is going to be quite critical for the monarchy. Another reason I'm saying this is if we look at this T-square here, Venus opposition Saturn squaring a Mars Jupiter, that Mars at 20 degrees of Gemini is exactly opposite King Charles's Mars at 20 degrees of Sagittarius. So we know that whatever happens in the world, whether you say whatever happens in America doesn't stay in America, it goes, forward across the world. But there are other things that could happen at this time that don't just stay where the events occur. So we may be looking at this period of time, whether this is to do with nature, to do with the earth itself, or whether it's to do politically, whether it's to do with conflicts already in place or new conflicts springing up. We can see that the King Charles is right in the center of this as well, that this also affects him. So maybe they're all different experiences responding to the call of these influences, and in different lives and in different ways, it all amounts to, where do we go from here? Where we've reached this point, the hopes, the ambitions, the things we set in motion back 4 years ago, they're now at this point, are they worthy of continuing? Have they run out of road? Where are we? And where do we go from here? That's the big question that we can see from these particular influences. I mentioned this at the beginning of my video here. We're living in accelerated times and things are already changing from day to day. So whatever's going to happen in the middle of August period, already today as things stand, could already be different by the 19th. But I think we should look at Kamala's chart, because it is so extraordinary how she has arisen from comparative invisibility, which is, now, she may not have been invisible in the United States, but she was invisible pretty well to everywhere else around the world. We knew who she was. We knew she was the vice president, and occasionally we glimpsed her here and there standing at the back while Joe Biden spoke or whatever. But when you look at this chart, and let's have a real look at this chart, it is an amazing chart. And in my Friday Bites, I've talked about Kamala, and I pointed out all sorts of things that are significant. So, if you want to read the stuff that I've written about her, you can do so. I'm going to give a kind of approximation here. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of the detail. We're just going to have a look at, some of the most important component parts. And what is significant in this chart, and I've drawn it out for you, is that she has what's called a kite configuration. Now, that means it's a combination of a grand trine and a mini grand trine, although I prefer to call that configuration, which involves a trine being intersected by two sextiles, I call it the hammock, because it strings together these planetary factors in a very, very relaxed way. But whatever you want to call it, we can see that by the time you've drawn in the angles, it makes a perfect kite configuration. Now, people who have a kite have a very powerful destiny to fulfill. Now, that destiny may be anything. It'll differ from person to person. But certainly when we're considering whether Kamala Harris has the astrological credentials to take on the presidency of America, and you see a kite configuration, you could say very quickly and easily off the bat, it is her destiny. Now, there are other reasons that I've looked at this, and one of them, I think, is the idea of the North Node being exactly on her ascendant, the nodal axis on her ascendant-descendant axis. And anything that falls on the angle is vaunted, is made stronger and more important. And it doesn't mean that everybody with the nodal axis on their ascendant-descendant axis is destined to have a very important effect on the world, but it probably means that the power of the personality is going to have a very strong effect on the surroundings. I think from memory, I could be wrong here, but I think Jennifer Aniston, for instance, has the North Node in the first house, or there's a nodal connection here. I could be wrong, but I just wanted to use an example that here is someone else who has extraordinary fame and the power to affect people's lives by the things she chooses to sanction or to follow. Then others will follow her. So a very, really big effect. So we see here with Kamala that the force of her personality, the force of her being, it also means she has to stand alone, that she has to take an independent stance. Now, that doesn't mean that she can't be married, that she can't have a happy marriage, because she is most certainly married. And it does seem, to all intents and purposes, to be a very happy marriage. But really, you stand alone with the North Node in your first house, and certainly if it's conjunct the ascendant. So we get this idea that this is a strong woman, and this is a woman who can stand alone and can make decisions that are hard decisions all by herself. Doesn't mean she won't, get other people's opinions. She is, after all, a Libran. And Librans love to mediate and to balance things out. But really, when push comes to shove, she stands firm. So I think in these two factors alone, we're looking at the kite configuration, we're looking at the nodal axis on the ascendant-descendant axis. And now we also want to look at the apex of that kite configuration. That's the planet that stands at the point of the kite. And we can see there that it's Saturn. Now, Saturn is a planet that we associate with struggle, that we associate with responsibility, that we associate with hard times, that we associate with gravitas. And if you have Saturn on your midheaven, you can rise to positions of power and authority and responsibility, but you can also be crushed by the powers of authority. The same thing, we're looking at the same principles, but in a different way. So here we can see that given what is happening at the Democratic Convention with that full moon, it is her Saturn, that either the mantle of responsibility is placed on her shoulders at that time, or the reverse, and we find that something else going on at that time is in fact detrimental to her fulfilling her future. And I wouldn't rule out of this pattern of things happening on the 19th of August or around that time, a sort of similar pattern that happened around the Republican convention, when it looked very much as though there would be all sorts of altercations and problems surrounding the anointing of Donald Trump. But of course, what we got instead was an assassination attempt. So it is possible. I'm not saying it will happen, but I think this period of time does have a sense of awe-inspiring events that may not necessarily be of the nature of democracy, so to speak, in terms of the things going on in the convention. They could be outside that, but they have an effect, and they may have an effect on what happens to Kamala, let me get her name right, as she goes forward. Now, also central to this, let's have a look at this Mars-Saturn opposition. Mars is at the opposite point to Saturn. Mars-Saturn combinations are difficult, and I have one myself. I have a Mars-Saturn conjunction, so I know what a struggle life can be from time to time with Mars and Saturn. But it doesn't necessarily mean you are thwarted in life and that you will never find happiness, you will never find success, nor does it mean you are cruel. I read somewhere once when I was a student and I read about Mars and Saturn that a lot of murderers had Mars-Saturn aspect, and it wasn't very pleasant to read. But I think we have to see this combination in many different guises and lights. And one of the pluses of a Mars-Saturn combination is that it makes you very persistent, and that you can be very organized, and you can drive yourself beyond what other people would, drive themselves. You have the capacity staying power, lasting power. And that's also within this particular configuration. So we know that the credentials are there for the presidency. We can also see what stands opposed to the fulfillment of that destiny. We've looked at it, we've surveyed the possibilities. But there's another factor that I think is very interesting about this particular chart and the nature of the Jupiter-Saturn cycle, is that Kamala herself was born on a Jupiter-Saturn square. And when the same aspect happens again, it also denotes a significant period of your life. And I think really with this Jupiter squaring Saturn, boosting the qualities of Saturn, everything that we have discussed so far about the sense of, power that Jupiter has, the sense of responsibilities and restrictions that Saturn brings, you have these qualities within your nature and within your destiny, if you like. So I actually think that the fact that she was born on a Jupiter-Saturn square and she now has a Jupiter-Saturn square at the time of this all-important Democratic convention is rather a tick in the box, in the sense that, yes, here it is, here is what you were meant to be and do. And actually, my personal feeling, I know I've given you a lot of possibilities here, but I think it's eminently possible that Kamala will go on not only to be anointed at the Democratic Convention, but go on to win the election. So there's a lot stored up in this particular set of configurations that we have yet to unfold, if you like. And I might say at this point, and of course, events are moving very fast, but it may not necessarily be that she faces Donald Trump at that election. I think there's so much that could change at this point that we can't make a blanket prediction. We're just looking at the most likely scenarios. Other things I should point out in this chart is the fact that Saturn at the moment and Saturn at the time of the convention will be opposing her Uranus-Pluto-Venus stellium in Virgo. And of course, at the time of that, if you remember, we're going to have Mars and Jupiter intercepting that Saturn opposition to Uranus, Pluto, and Venus. So that too is playing into the full narrative of this all-important period of time. Now, I did spend some time on my previous video talking about the Uranus-Pluto conjunction and its presence in the whole of the 1960s, so I don't want to repeat myself again. But I think a lot of people with that Uranus-Pluto conjunction in their natal chart, if it's connected to a personal planet or it's on an angle, really do get involved in politics, or they feel that they want to change things for people. They want to be the agent of change. And I think, again, we're seeing that both brought out very clearly by the influences at the time, but also because of the nature of these influences, there is a certain sense of difficulty in there as well. It's not easy. This is really challenging, and we really have to wait for the fulfillment or the unfolding of time before we actually nail the astrology, so to speak, in quite how this turned out. And so to my summing up of things, I mean, we've had a really, really good look at the meaning of the Jupiter-Saturn cycle, and we've had a look specifically at the day the Jupiter-Saturn square comes in. We've looked at the seeds being planted on the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction on December the 21st, 2020, and now growing. We can see the shoots of those seeds. And it's very interesting to think that that Jupiter-Saturn cycle came in at the time of the storming of the Capitol all those riots, and now at this point, not only are we looking at another election with the shadow of the previous election hanging over it at the time of that Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, but also we can trace the development, really, when we think about what happened on January the 6th and all around that time. It's at this time that all those court cases are coming about, that there is, at this Saturn square, there is a reference to what happened then and what happens now. And this will continue, because until we know what's going to happen exactly with Donald Trump standing or not standing for the presidency, whether he gets voted in or he doesn't get voted in, what happens in the wake of that, whether these cases that he still faces and the fate of the January 6th insurrectionists comes to pass, it's all in a reference point to the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, the beginning of the cycle. So coming to a more personal thing, more personal view. When we think about Jupiter and Saturn representing two completely opposite functions, with Saturn we get constriction and restriction, with Jupiter we get expansion and, in the spotlight kind of thing. So it's introvert versus extrovert. And when we think about this, we have Jupiter and Saturn in our own natal charts, and the relationship between Jupiter and Saturn is the interplay of those two is a little bit like driving a car with the accelerator pressed down hard and the handbrake on. There is a sense of going forward at speed with intensity and yet being blocked. It's the same with opportunities that arise on a Jupiter-Saturn square. The opportunities can be fantastic, and you can see what that's going to do, what could be possible thanks to this Jupiter scenario. But then what you also have is the attainment of those possibilities, making them happen, bringing them into reality. You face overwhelming odds in order to do that. So that's something that happens in our own lives in relation to our own Jupiter-Saturn cycle and the positions of Jupiter and Saturn in our chart. And it's also in reference to what's going on at the time, where we look with these situations. There is the promise of how things could be if only. There's the momentum towards them, but the obstacles in front are massive. So that's, again, a kind of dynamic that we're working with. And I would say, look at Jupiter in your own chart, look at Saturn. Are they engaged? Do they have a relationship with each other? Because wherever Jupiter is where you grow, where you perform, if you like, where there is joy, where there are things that you feel personally you can grow by, or where you want to stand on the stage of life, if you like, and be kind of positive, optimistic, and the center of attention, what can grow, if you like. And Saturn is about the fears that you may have about that, the restrictions you place upon yourself, and also the restrictions that may be placed on you by society or by your parents or by your peer group. So that existential relationship, which gets the upper hand. Does Jupiter give you the boost, the success, the joy, and the optimism you crave? Or does Saturn have the upper hand and you deny yourself that possibility, or events and other people get in the way of it? That's the dynamic between Jupiter and Saturn. And if you actually have those two planets in aspect with each other, you've got a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, you've got a Jupiter opposition Saturn, you've got a Jupiter-Saturn square, then everything I've just said is going to be a real dynamic in your life. You could almost say it is the existential drama of your life, just with these two very opposite planets. They're very different functions. So there we are. The second in this series is over. I hope that you found it really interesting, and it's all part of the this huge year of change that we're going to look back on and think, my goodness, what happened here? Look at all this that's gone on. And that is every bit as much in our personal lives as the drama being played out in different countries, different nations. So thank you for watching. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed, really appreciate it. It grows the channel. And I look forward to speaking to you here in a couple of weeks' time. Bye for now.